I want to start with a number, not a dramatic number, a very boring, very technical number that appears in a 2009 paper on paleolimnology, which is the study of what ancient lake sediments can tell us about past environments. The number is 1.7. It refers to a specific anomaly, a ratio of organic to inorganic material in a sediment core pulled from Lake Titicaca on the border of what is now Peru and Bolivia. The ratio, 1.7, appears at a layer corresponding to approximately 980 CE, give or take 30 years. And the reason it matters, the reason one of the study's authors flagged it in a footnote and then apparently never returned to it, is that 1.7 is not what you'd expect from a lake that had been stable for centuries. It's the kind of ratio you'd expect from a lake that had experienced a sudden and significant reduction in the population living around it. Not drought, not erosion, not a slow decline, a sudden reduction. I filed that number away. Then 3 months later, I was going through dendrochronological data from a completely unrelated study. Tree ring records from a series of ancient timber samples recovered from a building complex in what is now the Chaco Canyon region of New Mexico. Different continent, different study team, different decade of research. And buried in the supplementary data, not in the main body of the paper, a note. Anomalous growth cessation across sampled specimens consistent with a regional disruption event, date range approximately 1000 to 1050 CE, cause undetermined. Undetermined. I want you to sit with that word for a moment. Not unknown, not unexplained, undetermined. The researchers knew something happened. They couldn't determine what. I started looking for more of those words. Undetermined, inconsistent with surrounding strata, of unclear origin, disruption event without identified cause. And I found them. Not in one study, not in one region, not on one continent. I found them distributed across 3 years of reading across geological and archaeological and climatological literature from 6 continents, and they all clustered around the same window. Not the same year, not the same decade necessarily, but the same compressed historical moment, a band of roughly 80 to 100 years centered on what our calendar calls approximately 1000 CE, within which civilizations on every inhabited landmass on this planet appear to have experienced something that left a mark in the sediment, something that appears in the tree rings, something that ended cities, interrupted trade networks, collapsed agricultural systems, and in several well-documented cases erased populations entirely from locations they had occupied for hundreds of years, something that our historical framework addresses by giving each civilization its own separate explanation. And that's the problem. That's the thing I keep coming back to, because the explanations are all different. The Mayan collapse was drought. The Tiwanaku collapse was also drought, but a different drought. The Tang Dynasty fell to internal rebellion. The ancestral Puebloans abandoned their cities due to resource depletion. The Norse colonies in Greenland failed because of climate change. The Ghana Empire in West Africa fragmented due to trade route disruption and invasion. Every civilization gets its own story, its own cause, its own isolated region-specific explanation. What the explanations share in common, and I've spent a long time looking at this, is the timing. And nobody seems to want to look at the timing. Let me take you to Tiwanaku first, because it's the one that started me on this. Tiwanaku is an ancient city in Bolivia sitting at 3,850 meters above sea level on the Andean Altiplano, one of the highest ancient urban centers ever discovered. At its height, conservative estimates place its population at somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people, with a wider regional sphere of influence that may have incorporated several 100,000 more. It was a sophisticated civilization, agricultural terracing across terrain that modern engineers still regard with respect, a hydraulic management system that sustained crops at altitude, monolithic architecture whose construction methodology remains actively debated, and then, around 1000 CE, within a period of a few decades, it was gone. Not conquered, not burned, not buried under the sediment of a later civilization. Simply abandoned. The people who had been there were not there anymore. The official explanation is a prolonged drought. The evidence for that drought is real. Palynological data, pollen records preserved in Lake Sediment, shows a significant shift in regional vegetation consistent with reduced rainfall in the period around 1000 CE. I'm not dismissing that evidence. But here's the question that the official explanation consistently declines to answer. Where did they go? When a city is abandoned because of drought, the people move. They go somewhere with more water. They leave traces of that movement. Refugee populations appear in the archaeological record of adjacent regions. You can trace the migration. The civilizational fingerprint persists, displaced but present. After the Tiwanaku collapse, you get fragments, small settlements, disaggregated populations, but you do not get what you'd expect from a city of 10,000 to 20,000 people, plus its regional network. The numbers don't account for themselves. Some of the population is archaeologically unaccounted for. Not a few people. A significant portion of a civilization. Hold that. We'll come back to it. Now go east, cross the Pacific. Land in the Yucatan Peninsula around 900 CE, which sits at the early edge of the window. The classic Maya collapse is usually placed between roughly 800 and 950 CE. I want to be honest about that. It does not fall neatly into my 1000 CE frame, but it falls into the approach of it. And the specific pattern of the Maya collapse contains something the Tiwanaku story also contains, something I want to name carefully. The scholars who study the Maya collapse disagree on almost everything: drought, warfare, political fragmentation, epidemic disease, agricultural failure. These debates are ongoing and real. But there is one detail that sits beneath all of those debates that every serious scholar acknowledges, and almost none of them treat as the primary mystery. The abandonment was not uniform. Some sites were depopulated decades before others. Population centres collapsed while adjacent centres continued to function. The disruption moved through the region rather than striking it simultaneously. Something with a direction, something with a path. I don't know what that something is, I want to be clear about that, but the literature describes it. The wave-like spatial pattern of the Maya collapse is documented, noted, and then systematically absorbed into whatever site-specific explanation the researcher prefers. Nobody maps the wave. Go north to Chaco Canyon in the American Southwest. The ancestral Puebloans built at Chaco Canyon a complex of extraordinary sophistication. Great houses, multi-storied stone buildings containing hundreds of rooms, roads stretching for kilometers in straight lines across terrain that made straight lines difficult to achieve. Astronomical alignments built into the architecture with a precision that modern surveyors find genuinely impressive. Chaco was a hub, the center of a regional network that extended across hundreds of kilometers. By 1150 CE, it was abandoned. The official explanation: deforestation, resource depletion, prolonged drought. The same drought, incidentally, invoked for the Tiwanaku collapse on the other side of the hemisphere. The same general period, a different drought, presumably. But here's what the official explanation doesn't fully address. Chaco Canyon was not simply abandoned. It was closed. The great houses were deliberately sealed. Roof beams were removed and taken. Items that would normally be left behind in an abandonment were not left behind. This was not flight. This was organized departure. People chose to leave methodically, removing what they valued, sealing what they left. That is the behavior of people who know they are not coming back. Where did they go? The archaeological trail is partial. Some populations dispersed to known sites, others are less clear. And there is a specific class of sites in the region occupied during this period and then also subsequently abandoned, where the artifact assemblages are unusual. Where the material culture suggests populations that arrived from somewhere, bringing practices that don't match the local tradition. As if multiple streams of displaced people reach the same refugees in the same compressed window of time. and then those refugees too, in some cases, were abandoned. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Now leave the Americas entirely. East Asia. The Tang Dynasty, which had governed a unified China since 618 CE, collapsed in 907 CE. What followed was the Five Dynasties period, 53 years of fragmentation and military upheaval that left the Chinese historical record, which is extraordinarily detailed for this period, with a quality that scholars describe as chaotic. Not just politically chaotic, textually chaotic. Records from this period are fragmentary, contradictory, inconsistently preserved. The official explanation for the Tang collapse is internal rebellion, specifically the Huang Chao Rebellion of 875 to 884 CE and its aftermath. Real history. A real historical figure, a catastrophic rebellion. I'm not disputing any of that. But the Tang collapse coincided, within a few decades, with the disruption of the Khmer Empire's earliest hydraulic engineering projects in what is now Cambodia. It coincided with the fragmentation of the Pala Empire in Bengal. It coincided with a period that historians of Japan describe as a deterioration of central authority so severe that rural provinces were effectively ungoverned for decades. 4 separate political systems across a vast geographic arc of Asia, each with their own internal explanations for their disruption, all disrupted within the same compressed window. And beneath each of them, when you pull the sediment core data from the rivers and lakes of their respective regions, the same kind of anomaly. Deposition layers indicating disrupted agricultural activity. Pollen records showing vegetation stress. In several cases, the specific chemical signatures that appear in sediment when large numbers of people abruptly stop managing the landscape around a body of water. The water remembers when the people leave. West Africa. The Ghana Empire, one of the most sophisticated states of the medieval world, controlling the gold and salt trade routes across the Western Sahara, began to fragment in the mid-11th century. The official explanation: invasion by the Almoravid Berber dynasty from the north, combined with increasing desertification of the Sahel that reduced agricultural productivity. I'm not dismissing these factors. They happened. But the desertification of the Sahel in the 11th century is documented in sediment records across the region. Dust layers, pollen shifts, reduced organic input to lake sediments, the same kind of signal that appears in the Lake Titicaca data from Bolivia, the same kind of signal that appears in records from the American Southwest, the same kind of signal that appears in dendrochronological data from Northern Europe across the same general window. Not the same event, not identically dated, but the same kind of signal, on multiple continents simultaneously. What kind of event causes that? I want to go to the ice cores now, because this is the layer of the story that receives the least mainstream attention relative to how clearly it speaks. Greenland ice cores, drilled and analysed across multiple independent research programs since the 1960s, contain a record of atmospheric composition going back hundreds of thousands of years. Each layer of ice is a year. Each layer carries chemical signatures of what was in the air when it fell as snow, the layers corresponding to roughly 950 to 1050 by EC. E contains something that the researchers who found it described in a 1997 paper as an anomalous aerosol loading signature inconsistent with identified volcanic events of the period. They proposed several possible sources. They left the question open. Subsequent ice core programs, including cores drilled from Antarctica, from the opposite end of the Earth, also show elevated particulate content in the same general window. The specific isotopic profiles of that content have not been conclusively matched to any known eruption sequence. I want to be precise about what I'm saying. This is a global atmospheric signal appearing in ice cores from both poles in the same general time window that cannot be sourced to any identified geological event of sufficient magnitude. The official response to this, to the extent there is one, is that the signal may represent cumulative effects of several moderate volcanic events across the period. A reasonable hypothesis. But the hypothesis has not been confirmed. The isotopic match has not been made. The source remains, in the language of the literature, undetermined. I keep finding that word. Here is the part of this story that I find the most difficult to explain. Not the collapses themselves, not the sediment anomaly, not the ice core signal. What I find most difficult to explain is the absence of the paper, because the evidence I've been describing is not secret. It's not buried in restricted archives. It's in peer-reviewed journals, in technical reports, in supplementary data files that anyone with institutional access can read. The Lake Titicaca sediment data, the Chaco Canyon dendrochronology, the Tang Dynasty pollen records, the Sahol dust layers, the Greenland aerosol anomaly. These exist. They are accessible. What does not exist, to my knowledge, is a single paper that gathers them. A single published treatment that asks, what do these signals have in common? Do they point to a shared cause? And what would that cause have to be? That paper hasn't been written. Not disproven, not attempted and rejected, not published and ignored, simply not written. And I've thought a long time about why. Not in a conspiratorial sense, I want to be clear about that. I'm not suggesting a coordinated suppression. I'm suggesting something more structural and more interesting. The academic disciplines that would need to collaborate to write that paper are, by institutional design, kept separate. Paleolimnologists don't read archaeoastronomical literature. Historians of the Tang Dynasty don't attend conferences on Andean paleoecology. The data exists in silos. The silos have walls. And the walls are maintained not by censorship, but by the ordinary friction of academic specialization. The bureaucracy of disciplinary boundaries is more effective than any deliberate suppression. You don't need to forbid a question. You just need to ensure that the people who hold each piece of the evidence have no professional incentive to sit in the same room. The paper hasn't been written because no one whose career depends on writing it has been trained to see all the pieces at once. I want to name something carefully, because I'm aware of how this sounds, and I want to be precise about what I am and am not claiming. I am not claiming that a single catastrophic event destroyed every civilization on Earth in the year 1000. That is not what the evidence shows. The evidence shows something more subtle and more interesting. A period of global environmental stress of uncertain origin, which expressed differently in different geographic and ecological contexts, which interacted with the specific vulnerabilities of specific civilizations in ways that produced different kinds of collapse in different places, and which has been studied almost exclusively at the local level, producing a library of local explanations that are each individually defensible, and which collectively obscure the global pattern. That pattern is real. The sediment doesn't lie, the tree rings don't lie, the pollen record doesn't lie. Something happened in that window, something that struck not cultures, but the land beneath them. And then the cultures built their own explanations for what the land did. But here is the question that follows, and this is the one I cannot stop asking. If something happened at 1000 CE, is this the first time? Because when you go looking in the sediment record with the right questions, you don't find only one such layer. Around 536 CE, the most severe short-term cooling event in the past 2,300 years, preserved in tree rings from every inhabited continent, coinciding with the collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire's agricultural base, migrations across Eurasia, and the disruption of multiple complex societies simultaneously. Scholars debate whether a volcanic eruption, a comet impact, or some combination of events caused the cooling. The debate continues because no single explanation is adequate at the global scale. Around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age collapse. Every major civilization of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East within a few decades failed. The palace economies of Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, the city of Ugarit, erased so completely that its very existence was unknown until 1929. The Egyptian New Kingdom, which survived but was permanently diminished. Scholars have spent decades arguing about drought, invasion, systems collapse, earthquake, epidemic. Each site gets its own explanation. The global synchrony is acknowledged and then dissolved back into local stories. Around 2200 BCE, the 4.2 kiloyear event, a prolonged global drought coinciding with the collapse of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, the disruption of the Egyptian Old Kingdom, and the abandonment of settlements across the Indus Valley and China, documented in sediment cores, dated by multiple independent proxy records, and still treated in most of the literature as a series of regional events that happen to coincide rather than as a single global forcing with regional expressions. The pattern repeats, not regularly, not like clockwork, but recurring. Events of varying magnitude appearing in multiple independent proxy records simultaneously, coinciding with civilizational disruptions that the conventional historical framework consistently explains at the local level. What if the framework is the problem? What if what we call history, the record of civilizations rising and falling, of empires fragmenting and successors emerging, is actually the record of what happens in the intervals? What happens between the events that the sediment remembers and the civilizations forget? We are inside one of those intervals right now. The current interval began by the evidence of the geological record sometime after the last major disruption signal. We have built universities and satellites and ice core drilling programs sophisticated enough to read the layers beneath us. And what the layers say, clearly and repeatedly and in multiple independent archives, is that the interval always ends. What the layers do not say, because layers don't say things, is when. I've been sitting with this for a long time. The specific question of the 1000 CE window, the undetermined sediment anomaly at Lake Titicaca, the anomalous growth cessation in the Chaco Canyon timber samples, the missing populations of Tiwanaku, the unmatched isotopic signature in the ice cores, the paper that hasn't been written. The questions keep clustering, and I keep coming back to the same place, not an answer, not a theory, not a framework, a simpler observation. The civilizations that collapsed around 1000 CE did not in any documented case see it coming. They had their local explanations for local stresses that were in fact the local expressions of a global event. They looked at the drought and named the drought. They looked at the rebellion and named the rebellion. They had no frame for the pattern because the pattern was larger than any frame they had. We have better instruments than they did. We have sediment cores and ice cores and dendrochronological databases and satellite imagery and isotopic analysis. We have tools sophisticated enough to read the layer. We are reading it. And what we seem to be doing in discipline after discipline, archive after archive, is noting the anomaly, flagging the undetermined origin, filing the footnote, and moving on. The same thing the people at Lake Titicaca were doing when the ratio shifted to 1.7, and they did not know what was coming. The number is in the record is patient, and whatever the record is describing, whatever left that layer in the sediment of 6 continents simultaneously, it was not the last time.